The ballroom at Atherton House glittered with 1,000 candles, their light falling upon silk and jewels and polished smiles that rarely reached the eyes. Ilara Caldwell stood near a marble pillar, her gown the color of faded lavender, her gloved hands clasped in front of her as if she were waiting for someone who would never come. She was 22 years old, the paid companion of Lady Darlington, and she had perfected the art of being invisible. The other guests' gazes slid past her as though she were part of the architecture, and she had learned not to mind, or so she told herself. Her only indulgence was to watch the Duke of Ashford. Alexander Ashford was tall, dark-haired, and carried himself with the cool authority of a man who had never been denied anything. He stood across the room with a small circle of gentlemen, his expression unreadable, his posture immaculate. Ilara had no illusions. She did not dream of him noticing her, but watching him was like watching a storm contained in glass, something beautiful and unreachable. It made the endless evenings bearable. She did not mean to overhear. The crush of the ballroom had shifted, pushing her closer to a cluster of potted ferns, and behind them, the Duke and his friend Lord Harrington were speaking in low, careless tones. Ilara froze, her heart stumbling. "Miss Caldwell." Harrington said, amusement threading his voice. "The companion, I saw you glance her way, Ashford." Was a pause, then the Duke's voice, smooth and entirely indifferent. "I cannot imagine why. She has neither fortune nor connections. She is a shadow passing through a room, barely noticeable, certainly not worth the introduction." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Ilara felt each one sink into her chest, cold and heavy. She pressed her palm against the pillar, the marble biting into her skin. He had not said it with malice, that was the worst part. He had simply spoken the truth as he saw it. She was nothing, less than nothing. She turned before the burn behind her eyes could betray her, weaving through the crowd with her head high, though her vision blurred. The terrace doors stood open to the night, and she slipped through them, into the cool air that smelled of rain and roses. Only when she reached the stone balustrade did she let her shoulders drop. A single tear traced a hot path down her cheek before she dashed it away. She would not cry over a man who did not know she was alive. She would not give him that power. But the words had lodged inside her, sharp as broken glass. A shadow, barely noticeable. She had known, of course, that her position made her insignificant. Hearing it spoken aloud by the one person she had secretly, foolishly admired stripped away every carefully constructed layer of composure. The music from the ballroom drifted out, a waltz, bright and careless. Ilara drew a shaking breath and straightened her spine. She would return inside. She would stand beside Lady Darlington's chair and fetch her shawl and smile when required. She would be so invisible that no one would ever have reason to wound her again. And she would never, ever allow herself to care what Alexander Ashford thought of her. That was the vow she made to the stars that night. She did not know then how soon the Duke would force his way back into her life, or that he would save her before he destroyed her all over again. 6 weeks later, the invitation arrived. Lady Darlington's thin, beringed fingers held the heavy cream card as though it were a royal summons. "Ashford Park," she announced with deep satisfaction. "The Duke is hosting a fortnight's house party. We leave on Thursday." Ilara's stomach tightened into a knot. She said nothing. A companion did not refuse. She packed her modest trunk with steady hands and buried her dread beneath layers of duty. The journey would take 2 days by carriage, and she could endure anything for a fortnight. She had learned to endure. The first day of travel was uneventful. On the second, the sky darkened to bruised purple, and rain began to lash the carriage windows. The coachman pressed on, determined to reach Ashford Park before the roads became impassable. Ilara sat opposite Lady Darlington, who had dozed off despite the jolting, her head nodding against the velvet squabs. The wind howled and the carriage swayed alarmingly. It happened without warning. A sharp crack split the air, the carriage lurched violently, and Ilara was thrown against the door. She heard the panicked scream of the horses, the coachman's shout, and then the world tilted. The carriage slid sideways, careening down an embankment toward the churning river below. Glass shattered, wood splintered. Ilara was weightless, then submerged in shockingly cold water that stole her breath and filled her mouth before everything went black. She did not feel the strong arms that pulled her from the wreckage. She did not hear the shouted orders or the thunder of hooves. Later she would piece together fragments. The Duke had been riding ahead to meet them, had witnessed the accident, had plunged into the river without hesitation. He had carried her limp body to his own horse and ridden through the storm to Ashford Park, shouting for a physician before she was even laid in the great house's finest guest chamber. Ilara woke to firelight and the scent of lavender. Her body ached and her head throbbed, but she was alive. Lady Darlington, wrapped in a blanket and pale with shock, sat in a chair nearby. "My dear girl," she quavered, "you gave us such a fright. The Duke himself pulled you from the water. You owe him your life." Door opened before Ilara could process the words, and the Duke of Ashford stepped inside. He was still in his shirt sleeves, his dark hair disordered, his expression uncharacteristically tight. He stopped at the foot of the bed, and for a long moment he simply looked at her. Ilara's heart hammered. She remembered his voice in the ballroom, the casual dismissal that had cut her so deeply. Now he had saved her life, and she did not know how to feel. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice low and controlled. "You are recovering well, I am told." "So it seems," she managed, her throat raw. "I am told I have you to thank." Something flickered in his grey eyes, surprise perhaps that she did not simper or gush. He inclined his head. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," Ilara said quietly. "Not anyone," held her gaze for a beat too long, and in that pause the air between them shifted. Then he stepped back, his mask of composure sliding into place. "Rest now. You are safe at Ashford Park." He was gone before she could reply, the door clicking shut with quiet finality. Ilara stared at the ceiling, her emotions a tangled mess of gratitude, resentment, and a dangerous, unwanted stirring of something warmer. She had vowed to feel nothing for him. But he had plunged into a flooded river for her. And she could not forget the way he had looked at her just now, as if he was seeing her for the very first time. The days of her recovery passed slowly. The physician declared she must rest, and so Ilara spent hours in the vast library of Ashford Park, a room she loved instantly for its smell of old leather and its towering windows that faced the rose garden. Lady Darlington took her meals in her room, content to be pampered, leaving Ilara to wander the house alone. She did her best to avoid the Duke, but the house was only so large. She was curled in a window seat, a book of poetry open on her lap, when she heard his footsteps. She looked up, and there he was, standing in the doorway as if uncertain of his welcome. He was impeccably dressed now, his dark blue coat fitting him like a second skin. "You have discovered my favorite room," he said. Ilara closed her book. "It is a beautiful room. I hope I am not intruding at all." He walked toward the shelves, trailing his fingers along the spines. "I rarely see anyone in here. My guests prefer the card room or the billiards." "I have never been skilled at cards," Ilara said, "and I am not allowed in the billiards room." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "A loss for the billiards room, I am sure." She blinked, caught off guard by the hint of warmth. He had never spoken to her like this before, had never truly spoken to her at all. In London, she had been invisible. Here he kept appearing, watching her with an intensity that unsettled her. The following afternoon, she took a slow walk in the rose garden, still regaining her strength. She found a secluded bench and sat, tilting her face to the pale autumn sun. The crunch of gravel announced the Duke's approach, and her pulse quickened before she could stop it. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the bench. She nodded. He sat, and for a while neither spoke. The garden was quiet except for the distant hum of bees. Then he said, "You are not what I expected, Miss Caldwell." She turned to look at him. "What did you expect?" He considered the question. "Someone quieter." "I am quite quiet," she said, a small smile curving her lips. "When I choose to be." His gaze lingered on her face. "Yes, I am beginning to see that." Moment stretched, fragile and new. Then the sound of approaching voices shattered it. Lord Ashby, a neighboring baron with an easy smile and warm brown eyes, came striding up the path. "Ashford. There you are, and Miss Caldwell, I am delighted to see you on your feet. I was so concerned when I heard of the accident." Bowed over her hand with genuine friendliness, and Ilara found herself smiling back. Lord Ashby was uncomplicated, kind, and he looked at her as though she mattered. When he offered to escort her back to the house for tea, she accepted. The Duke watched them go, and a sensation he did not recognize coiled in his chest. It was sharp and unpleasant, and it tightened when Ilara laughed at something Ashby said. He stood alone in the garden, the sun warm on his shoulders, and realized with a jolt of dismay that he was jealous. Jealous of a man who could make her smile so easily, while he himself could barely manage a civil conversation without retreating behind formality. That evening at dinner, he was silent and brooding, his responses clipped. Ilara noticed, and it confused her. She had done nothing wrong. Yet every time Lord Ashby addressed her, the Duke's jaw tightened. When the meal ended and she rose to follow Lady Darlington, the Duke caught her eye from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but something in his gaze held her captive for a long, breathless moment. Then he looked away, and she was left standing in the doorway, her heart a tangle of questions she was afraid to answer. The ball at Ashford Park was meant to be the highlight of the house party. The great hall blazed with candlelight, the chandeliers dripping crystal and flame. Ilara stood near the edge of the dance floor, her borrowed gown a deep sapphire blue that Lady Darlington had insisted upon. It made her eyes look like twilight, and for the first time in years, she felt almost beautiful. Lord Ashby claimed her for the first dance, and she found herself laughing as he twirled her through the steps. He was attentive and undemanding, and his open admiration was a balm to her battered spirit. She did not notice the Duke watching from the sidelines, his glass of wine untouched, his expression dark. When the dance ended, a shadow fell over her. "Miss Caldwell," the Duke's voice was cool, "I believe the next is mine," was not a request. She placed her hand in his, and he led her into the waltz. His palm was warm against her waist, his steps flawless, but his face was a mask of stone. "You seem to be enjoying Lord Ashby's company," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "He is very kind," Ilara replied, matching his tone. "I enjoy kindness." Hand tightened fractionally. "You should be cautious. Men like Ashby are not always what they seem." She looked up at him, a spark of defiance igniting in her chest. "And what do you imagine he wants from me, Your Grace? I have no fortune, no connections. I am, as I have been told, barely noticeable." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. His steps faltered, almost imperceptibly, and a flicker of something, recognition, regret, crossed his face. But he said nothing. He finished the dance in silence, bowed stiffly, and released her hand as though it burned him. Later, when the music had swelled and the guests had grown louder with wine, Ilara found herself trapped near a cluster of gossiping ladies. She tried to slip away, but their voices rose, sharp and careless, and her feet would not move. "The companion," Lady Millicent said, her tone dripping with disdain, "thrown into the river, and suddenly she is the belle of the ball. One might think she arranged the accident herself." "She is nothing," another woman added. "The Duke only saved her out of obligation. Mark my words, he cannot wait to be rid of her." The laughter that followed was like acid on Ilara's skin. She turned her head, seeking escape, and her gaze collided with the Duke. He was standing not 10 feet away, a glass in his hand, his face unreadable. He had heard every word. She waited, her heart a frantic drum, for him to speak, to defend her, to say something, anything that would prove he did not see her as they did. He looked at her. Then he looked away, said a curt "enough" to the group, and walked out of the ballroom. The silence that fell was worse than the laughter. Ilara stood frozen, the wound in her chest cracking open anew. She had allowed herself to hope, foolish, reckless hope, that the man who had pulled her from the river might see her differently. But he was the same Duke who had dismissed her in a London ballroom. He would always see her as a shadow, and he would never risk his precious pride to step into the light for her. She did not cry. She was too hollow for tears. She walked out of the ballroom with her head high, and she began to plan her departure. Dawn had barely touched the sky when Ilara's trunk was carried down the servants' stairs. She had written a note to Lady Darlington, apologizing for the abruptness of her departure and citing a fabricated family emergency. It was not entirely a lie. Her heart was in a state of emergency, and she could not spend another hour under the Duke's roof. She was crossing the entrance hall, her pelisse buttoned to her chin, when a voice stopped her cold. "Going somewhere, Miss Caldwell?" The Duke stood at the foot of the staircase, still in his evening clothes from the night before, his cravat loosened and his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. He looked at her trunk, at her travel cloak, and something dark and desperate flickered across his features. "I am leaving," she said, her voice steady. "I have already informed Lady Darlington." "Why?" He took a step closer. "Because of what those women said." "Because I did not. Because I refused to be a source of entertainment," Ilara interrupted, her calm cracking at last. "I have spent years being invisible, Your Grace. I have been overlooked, dismissed, and spoken of as though I were furniture. I accepted it, but I will not stand in your ballroom and be humiliated while you walk away. You saved my life, and for that I will always be grateful, but you have also made it abundantly clear that I am not worth defending." He flinched as if she had struck him. "Miss Caldwell, I am not angry," she said, and the truth of it settled over her like a mantle. "I am simply finished. I deserve more than to be a shadow in someone else's life. I deserve to be seen." She picked up her reticule and walked past him toward the door. He caught her arm, his grip gentle but urgent. "Ilara." Her name on his lips was a plea, unguarded and raw. "Stay, please." She looked at his hand on her arm, then up into his face. For the first time, his mask had crumbled entirely, and she saw confusion and fear and something that might have been the beginning of love. But it was too little and far too late. "I stayed long enough to drown," she said softly. "I will not stay to be destroyed." She pulled free and walked out into the grey morning, leaving the Duke of Ashford standing alone in his great hall, his hands still outstretched toward the empty doorway, his heart a ruin he did not know how to repair. London was grey and indifferent, and Ilara found comfort in its anonymity. She took a small room in the modest home of her widowed cousin, Mrs. Thorne, and began to build a life that belonged only to herself. She gave piano lessons to the children of tradesmen, read voraciously, and slowly, week by week, the raw edges of her heart began to knit together. She did not think of Alexander Ashford, or she told herself she did not. though his face still visited her in quiet moments, and she would press her eyes shut until it faded. The Duke, in the meantime, was unraveling. He returned to London for the end of the season and moved through the glittering social calendar like a man walking through fog. He attended balls and dinners and card parties, but his eyes searched every crowd, and his conversation was distracted. His friends noticed, his rivals whispered. The unshakable Duke of Ashford had become restless, haunted, and no one knew why. He found her on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring. She was walking home from a lesson, a sheaf of music tucked under her arm, when a familiar voice spoke her name. She turned, and there he was, standing on the pavement in a plain coat and hat, looking nothing like the proud aristocrat she remembered. He looked thinner, older, and his grey eyes held a desperation that made her breath catch. "Miss Caldwell," he said, and the careful formality cracked on the second syllable. "I have been searching for you for weeks." She tightened her grip on the music. "Your Grace, I did not ask to be found." "I know." He stepped closer, and passers-by glanced at them curiously. "I know I have no right to be here, but I could not let things end as they did. I owe you an explanation. I owe you an apology." Ilara tilted her head, studying him. The old Ilara would have been overwhelmed, trembling with hope and fear. This new Ilara felt only a quiet, steady calm. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. I have made my peace with what happened." "Please," he said, and the word was so raw, so unlike him, that she hesitated. "Just a few minutes. I will not trouble you again after that." She led him to the small walled garden behind Mrs. Thorne's house, where a bench sat beneath a budding cherry tree. They sat, and the silence stretched until he broke it. "I heard what I said about you at Atherton House," he began, his voice low. "I did not know you were there that night, but that is no excuse. I was arrogant and careless, and I spoke of you as though you were a thing, not a woman. It was unforgivable." Ilara looked at her hands. "And at the ball, when those women spoke of me so cruelly and you said nothing, you only walked away." Closed his eyes. "I was a coward. I told myself I was preventing a scene, that engaging them would only draw more attention to you. But the truth is I was afraid of what it would mean if I defended you, afraid of what I was beginning to feel." He opened his eyes and met her gaze with desperate honesty. "I have never been afraid of anything in my life, Ilara, except this." "Except you." The confession hung in the air, raw and unpolished. The old Ilara would have softened, would have reached for him, but she had learned that her heart was not a thing to be offered to a man who only wanted it when it was out of reach. "I appreciate your honesty," she said quietly, "but it does not change what happened. I will not be someone's secret, Alexander. I will not be a regret you keep in the dark." Reached for her hand, and she let him take it, though she did not curl her fingers around his. "I am not asking you to be a secret. I am asking for a chance to prove that I have changed, that I can be the man you deserved all along." She withdrew her hand gently. "I do not need you to be that man anymore. I have learned to be enough for myself." She stood, and he rose with her, his face stricken. "Is there nothing I can say?" "You have said everything," she replied, and her smile was sad but genuine. "Goodbye, Your Grace." She walked back into the house and did not look back. Behind her, the Duke of Ashford stood alone under the cherry tree, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to have everything he wanted and to lose it through his own doing. A month passed. The season reached its fevered peak, and Lady Harrington's charity concert at her Grosvenor Square mansion was the event no one dared miss. Ilara attended with Mrs. Thorne, not as a companion now, but as a guest, her name on the invitation written in her own right. She wore a gown of soft sage green, and her hair was dressed simply. And she carried herself with a quiet confidence that drew admiring glances. Lord Ashby was there, and he greeted her with genuine warmth, though she sensed his interest had mellowed into friendship. She was glad of it. She was speaking with him near the refreshment table when the air in the room shifted. She felt it before she saw him, the prickle of awareness, the catch in her pulse. She turned, and the Duke of Ashford was standing in the doorway of the music room, looking at her as though she were the only person in the world. He crossed the room, and the crowd parted for him instinctively, whispers trailing in his wake. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of her, his face pale but resolved. Lord Ashby discreetly stepped aside. "Miss Caldwell," Alexander said, and his voice carried in the sudden hush. "I must speak with you, please." Ilara's heart beat hard, but she did not flinch. "We have already spoken, Your Grace. I am not certain there is more to say." "Then listen," he said, and without waiting for permission, he continued, his words ringing clear enough for those nearby to hear. "I have been a proud and foolish man. I have cared more for my reputation than for the feelings of the one person who matters most. I dismissed you when I should have admired you. I failed to defend you when you needed it most. And I let you walk away because I was too arrogant to follow." He took a breath, and his voice dropped to something intimate and raw. "But I am following now. I'm standing here in front of half of London, and I am telling you that I love you. I love your quiet strength, your sharp mind, your grace under cruelty. I love the way you see the world and the way you have taught me to see myself. I am asking you, begging you to give me one more chance, not to own your heart, but to earn it. Silence in the room was absolute. Ilara felt the weight of dozens of stares, but she saw only him, the proud duke stripped of his armor, his eyes wet with unshed tears, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. She had dreamed of being seen, but she had never dreamed of this. She took a step closer, her own voice steady. You have made a very public spectacle, your grace. A ghost of his old wryness touched his lips. I find I no longer care what anyone thinks, only you. Ilara looked at him for a long, breath-held moment, then she extended her hand. Then you may call on me tomorrow, we will talk, properly this time. Took her hand and raised it to his lips, and the kiss he pressed there was both a promise and a plea. The room erupted in murmurs, but neither of them heard it. They saw only each other, and the fragile, trembling hope that had finally found its voice. He came the next morning, not in a grand carriage but on foot, carrying a small posy of wildflowers. Mrs. Thorne, wide-eyed and flustered, showed him into the parlor, but Ilara suggested they walk in the small park at the end of the street. She wanted this conversation to happen under the open sky, away from walls and the ghosts of old expectations. They walked along the gravel path, the early summer sun dappling through the leaves. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Alexander drew a breath. I have rehearsed 100 speeches, he said, and none of them feel right. Then do not give me a speech, Ilara said gently. Just tell me the truth. He stopped walking and turned to face her. The truth is that I was raised to believe that emotion was weakness. My parents' marriage was a cold arrangement, and I learned early that caring for someone gave them the power to hurt you. So I built walls, high ones, and I convinced myself I did not need anyone. Down his jaw tight. Then you came along with your quiet dignity and your love of poetry and your refusal to be broken by people who had no right to judge you. You terrified me, because I knew from the moment I pulled you from that river that you had the power to bring those walls crashing down. Ilara listened, her heart aching with understanding. I was not trying to break your walls, Alexander. I was just trying to survive. I know. His voice was thick, and I punished you for it. I pushed you away because I was afraid of what I felt, and then I lost you, and I realized that the walls I had built were not a fortress. They were a prison, and I was the only one inside. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers cool and steady. I spent a long time believing I was nothing because people like you told me I was nothing, but I have learned that my worth is not determined by anyone else's opinion, not even yours. She met his eyes, clear and unwavering. I do not need you to feel whole, Alexander, but I have found that I want you. Not the duke, not the title, not the grand estate. You, the man who reads poetry and saves drowning women and is so terribly afraid of his own heart. His breath shuddered out of him. I am still afraid, he confessed, but I am more afraid of a life without you. She smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking over a long, dark night. Then stop being afraid. I am here. I am not leaving. He pulled her gently into his arms, and she went willingly, her cheek resting against the solid warmth of his chest. His heart beat strong and fast beneath her ear, and she felt the tension drain from his body as he held her. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt your worth again, he murmured into her hair. I will shout it from the rooftops if you wish. I will fill every ballroom in London with the truth of how magnificent you are. She laughed softly, pulling back just enough to look up at him. No rooftops, just this, just us. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones, and he looked at her as though she were the answer to every question he had ever been too proud to ask. Then he kissed her, tender and reverent, a kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings, and a love that had been forged in the fire of its own destruction and risen, finally, whole. When they broke apart, the park was quiet around them, the world unchanged and yet utterly transformed. He kept her hand in his as they walked back toward the house, and she did not pull away. She had walked away once, and in doing so she had taught a duke how to fall, not into ruin but into love, the kind that held fast, that healed, that saw two people not as shadows and statues, but as equals finally at last.